Welcome. On behalf of RIKK, Institute of Gender Equality and Difference, and GEST program, at the University of Iceland, I would like to welcome you all to the third talk of the 2020 Spring Term Lecture Series, which is devoted to gender and climate change. The lectures are held in collaboration with the National Museum of Iceland. My name is Auður H. I'm a bioethicist, but I'm now studying economics and working at the economics department at the university here. I will be the moderator, as you might assume now. Our speaker today is Auður H. Ingólfsdóttir. Auður has an educational background in international relations with a special focus on global environmental issues, natural resource management, and gender. She has taught at the GEST module on gender and climate change for several years and is currently involved in a GEST project whose aim is to develop short training courses on gender and climate change in Malawi. Today's lecture, entitled Climate Change, Gender Equality and Development Cooperation, focuses especially on the link between gender and climate change in Sub-Saharan Africa, and discusses the importance of integrating gender concerns into climate policies and programs in development cooperation. The role of education and awareness raising will be highlighted. So just welcome.
Thank you. And welcome all of you. Happy to be here with you today. I will be speaking in English, since about half of the guests are not Icelandic speaking. I'm not sure where this noise is coming from. Anyway, the lecture has already been introduced, what I will be focusing on, but I want to take a little bit of time to explain why I'm talking about this topic and what it is in my background that has led me to combine these different topics of gender issues, of environmental issues, and now development cooperation as well, because these are sort of three fields that are merging together. And my background, my educational background was already mentioned, which is international studies. And during my master's, during my bachelor studies, I focused on development and development cooperation. I was already very much interested in that. And then in my master's studies, I really, almost all of my courses were related to global environmental issues. And this was in 97 to 99, so more than 20 years ago. And it was around the time that the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated. So climate change was sort of coming to the agenda. Not nearly as forcefully as it is today, but it was a big issue, and I was very interested in it. And when I came to Iceland, I was working in the environmental sector, both through education. I was working here at the University of Iceland, teaching about these issues. I worked for 15 months in the Ministry for Environment, where I was engaged in climate-related work. I was also a climate project leader at Landvernd, which is an environmental NGO. So for about a decade, climate change was always somehow somewhere very close by, no matter what I was doing. And then I took a little bit of a detour, and I went and did to work for the Icelandic Crisis Response Unit, which is a part of our foreign ministry, Friðargæslan, for those of you that are Icelandic. And I did 2 missions with them abroad, doing something totally different, more related to my international relations interest than my climate change interest. And in my second mission there, I actually worked for UNIFEM, which is today UN Women, in the Balkans, as a gender advisor. And I kind of almost went into that by accident. I had interest in gender equality before that, but I cannot say I was a big expert on it at the time. I'm not sure how I got the job, but there I was. But of course, I got more interested in it at a professional level, working in that field. And the reason I'm telling you this is because towards the end of my time in Macedonia, where I was stationed in the Balkans, which was middle of 2008, I started getting these emails into my inbox about climate change and how UNIFEM and the UN gender equality institutions needed to start talking about climate change because gender was forgotten in climate change. And I remember thinking, what in the world do those two topics have to do with each other? I have been working on climate change for, like I said before, 10 years and had never seen any relationship to that before. And it was never talked about either. So my first reaction was like, what? Come on, don't try to put gender into everything. This was some time ago. Now I do it all the time. But then I started thinking, okay, I'm working in gender equality. I have been working in climate change, and I'm curious. So I came home in 2008, and I was curious. And I actually ended up doing a PhD on the links between gender and climate change. So now I know that there are many links. And I see more and more the more I work on this topic. So I just wanted to give you that background to say why I got into that. And my PhD work was actually more focused on the Arctic, and it was focused on sort of using feminist theories and as analytical tools, a little bit different from what I'll be talking about today. But I have been teaching in the GEST programs, so I will see those of you that are from that program later on talking about some of these issues in a bit more depth. And I have, like I said, been interested in development and have some work experience in developing countries, so that was also an interesting new direction to take these topics for me, how it can be integrated into development work. But before I go into that connection, I just want to briefly just give like a brief overview. What are those links? Those links that are obvious to me today, but I couldn't see 10, 15 years ago. And just to make it very simple, if you're thinking about it in terms of gender as in men and women, you could see very quickly three obvious links. One is, and this has something that's been maybe more focused on in the developed world, in industrialized countries, which is if you hear talks about carbon footprints, for example, who is contributing to the problem, and how are females and males different in that respect, both in terms of their lifestyles, because there are some differences there on average, but also in terms of where you're placed in society, how you can influence decisions in corporations, in the homes, and so on. So that's one link. And there are lots of research available that shows that women and men do tend to have slightly different behaviors around environmental issues and climate change. Second is who really suffers from the consequences. This relates to adaptation. And there you also see, in particular in the developing world, differences between men or women, simply because of the differences in gender roles. And in the beginning, when this topic sort of came on the international agenda, this was usually the first thing that popped up, and it was in a way maybe a bit simplistic. It was kind of like, oh, we need to think about gender when we talk about climate change, because in the developing world, women have to fetch water, and they might have to walk longer distances, or to get fuel, firewood, things like that. And then, oh yeah, I understand. But the story didn't go very much further than that. So that it's an issue, but it's a rather simplistic picture. And now we are seeing a much more complex picture with more research that I will get into when I get into the lecture more. So those are two. And then a third link that I think is also very important is engaging both men and women in policy. Who is involved in finding solutions? And this relates to both the negotiations at the international level. It relates to creating policy at the national and regional level, and just all project work. If you are coming in with a new technology into a community that might, for example, cooking stoves that use renewable energy, train women to talk to the women that need those cooking stoves, for example. I mean, think about gender in that context when you're looking at the solutions, both in terms of adapting to the situation, but also in creating low-carbon development paths. So those are sort of the three obvious links. And I already started talking about some of this in terms of, well, how is all this related to development cooperation? Because then we're not just talking about the situation in developing countries, we're also talking about these hundreds and thousands of projects all around the world where the more well-off countries come into developing countries and are trying to help them with development projects. And there's a lot of money involved, a lot of man hours, so we need to think about how we're using those resources in the best way. And more these projects are focusing on climate change because that's becoming such a huge issue. And what we are honing into now is, like, how can we make sure that gender is not forgotten in that work, that we integrate that into the picture. And one thing that makes climate change actually kind of interesting when it comes to development cooperation is the nature of the problem. This is a global problem. What does that mean? It means everything that we are doing that increases emissions of greenhouse gases, it goes into the atmosphere and it goes into some sort of a global common. And the atmosphere circulates around the planet, and those that actually feel the negative consequences of me driving a big Jeep or making bad decisions in my business that release a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, those might be people that I will never see, that live on the other side of the globe. And unfortunately, developing countries tend to be more vulnerable. So we have the rich countries that are responsible for the problem, and the developing countries that have to deal with bigger share of the consequences, both because where they are located and how the climate change plays out, but also because the infrastructure might be weaker, so it's more difficult to deal with the changes. So in a way, this is in a way, you could say climate change unites these worlds. It unites, it's one of those topics we're all in it together and we have to work together. But there is even an extra special responsibility of those that are richer off to help out where the consequences are bigger. Again, how do we link all these topics together? It's not just that men and women behave differently, that the consequences would be different for men and women. In general, it's also just very strongly related to social justice. Because in general, what you can say is what climate change does, it can do very different things in this place and in this place, depending on the circumstances, depending on the geography, depending on culture and so on. But what it does in most cases, which is sort of a generalization, is that it puts extra pressure. So if there is inequality, whether that's a gender inequality or class inequality or any kind of inequality between groups, it is likely to magnify this inequality unless you intervene in a specific way. This sort of puts more pressure on those that are already vulnerable. So there might be social justice issues, including gender equality, that have been very important. They might become even more important now. Okay, so if we are then going to integrate gender issues into development cooperation, what does that mean? We have to ask ourselves certain questions. And so how can we do that? How can we integrate gender into planning and design of climate-related projects and policies? Well, we cannot do it unless we know the situation, unless we do some sort of analysis so we know how the different gender roles, for example, do shape how women and men experience the consequences of climate change in different ways. And these analyses, they cannot just be done once and for all, because they can be very different in Malawi or in Indonesia or in Brazil. Be totally different issues depending on the local context. So we need research. We need knowledge that can feed into successful intervention into all these programs. And it was interesting for me because I mentioned I did my PhD on these connections between gender and climate change. And in the beginning, I wasn't sure about my focus, so I did a lot of reading. And at the time, my feeling was that there wasn't very much knowledge available. And it was kind of like this link that I mentioned before, the picture of the woman that was walking a little bit further to fetch water. And that was kind of, I just read that over and over and over again, and then I couldn't really get much further in terms of what kind of background analysis do we have here. And then my research ventured into a little bit different direction, but now I kind of went back to this literature several years later. And thankfully, a lot had happened in between. And we do have quite a bit of research now, looking a bit more deeper into these questions. And I found several articles when I was looking into this, doing these preparations, both for this lecture and also because I forgot to mention that in the beginning, but I think you mentioned it, that I'm going to actually tomorrow to Malawi to continue working on this project there that I will tell you about in the end. But I decided to take this particular article. Just to give you a snapshot of the kind of research that's being done. It's very recent. It was published only end of last year. And I liked it because it has case studies from both Africa and Asia, around the world. 25 qualitative studies where they looked at what they call climate hotspots. So they picked locations that are vulnerable due to the changes in climate that are already taking place. Some of them are vulnerable. They're vulnerable for different reasons. You see here the type of the semi-arid regions, both in Africa and parts of South and Central Asia, deltas in Africa and South Asia, and then glacier and snowpack-dependent river basins in the Himalayas. So they were communities in those three types of hotspots, mostly communities that were reliant on agriculture, livestock, and fishing. So sort of very much natural resource-based communities, but supplemented by wage labor, trade, and income from remittances. And they wanted to explore the agency of the individuals to adapt to these changes that were taking place due to climate change, with a focus on power relations and the role of gender. And here you see some of the environmental risks that they were dealing with, different depending on which locations they were in. Droughts, floods, changes in rainfall, land erosion, landslides, floods because of glacial lake outburst, heat waves, coastal erosion, cyclones, and there were others as well. So there's different kind of consequences. And I'm just going to give you two examples because it shows how the same issue, climate change, can play out very differently in different places with respect to gender. So this first example is from a pastoral community in East Africa, and in this case, the men were responsible to traveling with the cattle to find water for them, not the women. And very often they had to travel maybe 15 or 30 kilometers, and often actually the women went with them. And then they were able to get some milk, and they could use the milk in their home. Maybe sell it or at least give it to their family. But now, in some cases, they had to travel up to 150 kilometers. So that means they were away for a longer time, and leaving the women with the responsibility alone at home. And they sort of lost this opportunity of benefiting from the milk. So that was one example of what was happening in this particular community. And the other example is in India. And in this, it's a specific place in India where they were dealing with, in particular, water scarcity that created some very big difficulties in agriculture. So they couldn't really support themselves only with that. So the men had to go away to find some other employment to supplement the income. And they had to, the options that were available for them in this particular case was actually quite difficult working conditions. So they were not very happy in this situation. They had to go away, be away from their family, work in some really shitty jobs. More pressure on the women that were at home. And in some cases, they ended up spending all the extra income because the men came back and they were sick, because this is not a good working situation. So you see, there are quite different issues that come up here. So if you want to design, if you want to come into these kind of communities and design a project, and you want to think about these gender roles and the different roles different groups play, you have to know these kind of things to make sure that you design your intervention in such a way that they're helpful for the communities. It's basically what we're trying to say. And just as there is more research than there was when I was first looking at this topic about 12 years ago, there is thankfully also examples of projects around the world, more and more projects that have been putting some thought into integrating these things into their program design. This is from a booklet that is published by a network that is called Global Gender and Climate Alliance. And it was established in 2007, which is around the time when gender first starts to come up in the discussion about climate change. Remember, I told you when I started getting those emails in my inbox, that was 2008. Because actually, when you look at the original climate change convention that was negotiated and signed in Rio in 1992, there's not a single reference to gender. It was completely ignored, which is different from some other international agreements. Like we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, Convention to Combat Desertification, and also what was called Agenda 21. All those agreements were signed in Rio in 1992. All of them had some reference to gender, except the Climate Change Convention. It was completely gender blind. And it stayed that way, the negotiations and all the work on climate change, for quite a long time. So it's only around this time that it starts coming into the discussion. And this network was created by several women advocacy bodies that came together for this very purpose, that they had seen this gap and said, we need to somehow work on this and put this on the agenda in the international negotiations and on all the other processes. So that's their objective, to ensure that climate change policies, decision-making and projects are gender responsive, that this is not just forgotten. And in this booklet, they have 13 case studies where they are that have some good example of where this idea that gender and matters for climate change has gone from just being an idea into some concrete action. And they're showing how that matters on the ground. And what's interesting in when you go into this sort of actual analysis and collect data and so on, that there can be all kinds of surprises that you wouldn't think about until you start doing this mapping. And there might be some very, very small things that can make a big difference. And here's one example from Senegal, for example, where there was a research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. And there was a lot more to this program, not only this thing. But one thing that they found out was that in terms of how you get information about weather and weather-related patterns and so on. If you are in agriculture and it matters to you, you need to know when is it going to rain, when it's going to be dry, and so on. That the men were more likely to get weather forecasts from rural radio stations, but the women were more likely to receive it through informal sources. They would ask their friends and so on. And I actually saw the same point made in some other article I was looking at, including in Malawi, where I'm going, that this seemed to be common. And then you have to think, okay, but the women needed this information because they were very much involved in agriculture in different ways maybe than the men. So then became an example of an intervention. How can we make sure that everyone gets the information that they need to take as good advantage of the weather forecasts as possible? In this case, it meant, of course, we're going to continue with the radio, but in addition, they would have local agricultural extension agents really make a point of bridging this gap, of getting this information to the women directly. This could be by going into the communities and telling them. It could also be like sending SMSs. I think that was done in some cases to the local farmers. Very simple measures, but you wouldn't think about it unless you have really gone through. The case in Malawi, the research I was looking at they basically measured how you got the information, and then they asked also, like, for when you have in the same household a man and a female, married couples, and they found out they didn't share information. And just by revealing that and making everyone aware of that, they came back a couple of years later. They probably talked about it's actually important that you share this information. Oh, okay. 2 or 3 years later, it had changed. People just started talking together more because they became aware of that it was important to share it. So it doesn't have to be complicated once you know where you can intervene. So this is kind of the point here, that we need this awareness raising. We need knowledge. We need awareness raising, because if we don't have that this is actually, like I mentioned before, I was working in this for 10 years and somehow I never made this connection. So unless you have that awareness, then you're very likely to miss these kind of opportunities that might be very simple but effective. And also, of course, larger intervention as well. And that goes to both how to adapt to the changes and also in terms of being creative in searching for solutions. And here in our part of the world, it is a lot about creating awareness so people will change their lifestyle to reduce their emissions. In the developing countries, the focus might be, depending on where you are, of course, because they are large. But at least in the most poor countries, the emissions from individuals isn't very high. So there isn't very much you can lower. And there you want development. You want to increase the well-being of people living in these communities. So there the focus is maybe more on how can we increase the well-being of people without adding a lot to the emissions. How can we make sure everyone has access to electricity, but that it's from renewable sources? These kind of things. And in that case, that also is an area where it's important to involve, to have the gender issue in the forefront when you design your projects. Okay, so it's just like very much snapshot of how, I'm just trying to sort of map out why those links are important. And the reason I have this awareness raising here towards the end is because I want to end the lecture to talk about what the GEST program has been doing, in addition to having the program here in Iceland, and how that relates to my upcoming trip to Malawi, because that is about awareness raising. It's about creating awareness about those links. And there was a project that is, 2011 to 13, it's quite some years ago when it started, that was initiated by the GEST program in cooperation with the Icelandic Foreign Ministry, Norway, Denmark, I think, and then, of course, in cooperation with local partners in Uganda, where they developed a short 5-day training course on gender and climate change. And it was piloted in 3 districts in this period, and then last year it was taught once again also, with some updated material. And the objective of this course was to build knowledge and understanding of the causes of climate change and its impact on development and gender relations, of course with this idea that people that were involved in creating projects and doing policy at the district level would then integrate that into what they were doing. And it was, there was an evaluation report. I was not involved in this project at the time. I knew about it and followed it. This is the front page of the training manual that was used. But there was evaluation done, and it received a quite good evaluation, so there was an interest to continue. And that is what we are doing now, which is to go into a new country with the same idea. So the next country is Malawi. Are there anyone here of the GEST students from Malawi? Yay, great. I've, of course, been scanning the available material and so on, and quite a bit of the work that has been done by former GEST fellows that took the courses here. So it all kind of comes together. But Malawi is, you see here the climate vulnerability index. There are areas in Malawi that are extremely vulnerable to climate change. There are already some serious consequences there. So that is already an obvious reasons for why we would choose Malawi as a country to work with. But also is simply that the relationship already exists. There's a long history of development cooperation between Iceland and Malawi. There have been students here. There are students here from Malawi. So that just makes it easier to start a project. And there was a staff person here, Vietis, for those of you that know that went there in August, September, to sort of see, is there interest in Malawi, in ministries, in the university, to do something like that? And the answer was yes, there was interest. So that's why I'm going to follow up on that. So when I meet those of you that are in the GEST program in April, hopefully I'll have some more insights into this topic by then. But I think this was my last slide. Yeah, we'll have good time for questions and thoughts and comments.
So, any questions?
I think you mentioned earlier about individual consumption and individual usage, especially in developing countries, is kind of insignificant in the larger scheme of like climate change and the environment. But I think the problem is there's a lot of pressure still, and because developing communities are quite vulnerable to international pressure, it seems to be that that's the focus as opposed to focusing on larger scale industries and things like that. So from a development context, how do you kind of change the narrative into helping big agencies look at industry rather than small development communities?
Very good question. One of the things I saw when I was doing the research for Malawi was there was a research done to ask people in Malawi, sort of farmers, I think it was mostly farmers, what do you think are the reasons for climate change? And I think it was 60% that answered that it was local deforestation. And explanation number 2 was it's God's will. And there were like 6% that were aware of the global aspect of it. It's very tricky. I think what I would say is by creating awareness, you have to pick the people that you want to come into your awareness raising training program. In mind, like, where are they located? How can they influence beyond their individual lifestyle, for example? So, try to get people that are involved in industry. Create awareness among those that are in a position to do more than just change their individual behavior, but to have more large-scale decisions. There is certain value in creating the awareness of your personal footprint, because for a lot of people it's the easiest piece of information to digest in the beginning. oh, okay, I should walk rather than take the car. Okay, you just kind of understand it. And at least this is how I approach it as a teacher, to see that as a window to something larger. Realizing that's only a very, very small piece. You're not going to solve the problem that way. Or very often here in Iceland, for example, it's about recycling. Oh yeah, I recycle. I mean, I for the first 2 weeks, I cannot get the students out of talking about recycling. It's like, I want to talk about the big questions. But then at some point I realized, okay, we just have to talk through those issues that are closest to us. And then if we continue, we can move to the larger issues as well. I don't know if those are my thoughts on it. I don't know if it answered the question.
My question is, as you go to Malawi, what exactly will you be targeting in regards to the research and work that you're doing? Because I ask that because in the urban areas, there is talk of climate change adaptation and mitigation, but it's mostly from a paperwork point of view, when we look at all these documents and stuff. But in the rural, remote areas, they already have strategies on climate change mitigation and adaptation, but they just don't call it that. They already do that, they just don't call it that. And what they need is support, for example, in funding, because a lot of the strategies they use are makeshift. They're not necessarily technologically advanced, but they're makeshift. And what they need is financial support to be technologically advanced for like much larger effects. And a lot of climate change interventions and meetings happen in town, where I want to say that we don't necessarily care that much, because we don't experience the direct effects of climate change consequences. The ones in the remote areas do, and they also don't have access to like mainland. They are in very far places that take hours to get to, and so yeah. Who exactly are you targeting?
Good question. We are very much basing it on the model in Uganda, just because that worked out well. So the focus is on the districts, so that they will not be in Lilongwe, the short courses. But that will be one of the things I'll be discussing in this field trip to Malawi now. Like, where should we go? What are the areas that are most useful to start? Because we will start with pilot courses, and then if everything goes as we dream of, they will be all around the country. But
and seeing that you're adopting a model that worked in Uganda and Malawi are not the same, are you going to be taking into consideration the context of Malawian cultures and the power dynamics that are on the ground in Malawi?
Yeah, that's why it's so important. I'm coming here from Iceland to Malawi, but it's impossible to do this without a team from Malawi. So I will be visiting the universities there. There are people there that have been quite engaged. And the way that this was structured in the Uganda case is that there was a sort of global part, and then the second part was completely adapted to the Uganda context. And that needs to be completely rewritten for the Malawian situation. Yeah.
More questions?
So the developing industry is definitely helping, but it's also an industry. And for many of the big organizations, having a gender lens is also an economic obstacle, because it's just another thing that they have to apply to their projects. So how do you convince some of the bigger industries or NGOs to actually apply this? I know that there is a growing aspect of having feminist principles when they do developing projects, but is that something that you see in your work? Is it difficult to kind of, I would say, demand that you have to have a gender lens when you do development projects?
I think the only way to do it is to keep reminding. And I know, for example, when I worked with UNIFEM in the Balkans, it was kind of the role of this UN or the UN Women Today organization in all meetings to remind, because people might have goodwill, but they simply forget because they have other things on their mind. And so it's a competition of attention. And the only way to get through is to just keep going. I think but of course then there are ways to do it in a more structured way, to having certain criteria related to how you design a project and these kind of things. And the thing, like for example, when the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated, there was a mechanism called Clean Development Mechanism, which was this idea that because you are not demanding developing countries to reduce emissions, they want to continue to develop, but you can go as a richer country, do a development project, and you will do it in such a way that the emission will not increase because you use renewable energy or something like that. And then you get some credit. And there were lots of funding in that. And there was done analysis of where does this funding go to. And then there was a gender analysis. And it was like, 2% women or something. It all went to some large corporations or very specific projects. So unless and that was an eye-opener because nobody was thinking about gender when that instrument was designed. Now we have new instruments with climate funding in developing countries, and they are much more aware of. We need to keep it in mind, otherwise the power structure in our societies and around this globe are still in such a way that they will just all be sucked up by the big industries that are generally still ruled by men, for men. So yeah, it's just keep going.
In your view, where do you see the future of carbon trading, dealing with small enterprises of individual women in deep areas, rural areas of Africa? What do you envisage?
Are you saying that that's what we see, or are you asking if I see that?
I'm just asking you this about it and probably find out if you see that.
Yeah. I don't really see that as maybe the best available option on a micro scale. It can work for the big industries in many cases, and it is already doing so, for example, within the EU. It can be a forceful economic instrument, but I think it will be very complicated. I think when it comes to individuals or very small companies, we've more gone towards the carbon footprints and just sort of being aware of your carbon footprints, but not in terms of buying and selling your allowance to increase your footprints. I think that might be rather complicated, but I'm willing to reevaluate that if I see some examples of successful projects.
Yes, thank you. Some countries in Africa are now becoming a dumping sites for electronic waste. And so I'm wondering whether through your research you've also considered that aspect of how it affects climate change and what can be done about it.
Basically avoiding, you mean? Are you thinking about, there has been, of course, the hazardous waste,
Right.
these kind of things.
Yes.
Are you thinking about a different aspect of that comes with climate change, or?
Right. I'm thinking that all these electronic things that are old,
Mhm.
where they consume more electricity and so on. So now they are dumping them on us. We are buying them as used products, and they consume more energy. So have you come across this problem as part of your work?
Yeah, I have not seen that in the research I've been doing now. But yeah, it just shows how complex the issue is. There are endless sub-issues that come up. But I don't remember in the current research seeing that issue pop up with respect to climate change.
Is this project also mentioned how to benefit this kind of role of gender, climate change to the future generation, to the kids? Because sometimes the kids can be pressure for the family. As the reminder
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in the evaluation report for Uganda, they had a lot of stories of what the individuals that were on that participated in the 5-day courses, what they then did with their knowledge. And there were many interesting examples of people going out into their communities and starting some projects. And there were some people in the schools that started some school-related projects. So, I mean, this particular project is not going to target children or youth, but I think if you target people that are in position to influence then further, that can go into many directions. So I think it would relate to how we think through which people to target. Like, for instance, I think I read it, maybe if someone was involved in this project here knows better. I think I read it that initially people working in schools weren't necessarily in the target group, but then they did involve some there, and they did some interesting things as a follow-up in their context. But this is, of course, only just one small project that's not solving the climate issues in Malawi, but just a small contribution, hopefully.
I would like to draw your attention back to introduction. You categorize the impact of climate change on the basis of developing and developed countries. My curiosity lies with the fact that are you committing that the developed to say countries are not having the effect of climate changes, or that the less developed countries are much more at the vulnerable sides of the climate change? Could you clarify that?
Yeah, I mean, partly it's just simply what the discourses has been. That when the gender first started coming into the discussion, it was kind of gender and climate impacts in developing countries, and gender and emissions and lifestyles in developed countries. That's where the research was focused on. So that's one thing. Another thing is, because we have a lot of impacts also, obviously, in the fires in Australia, we have our melting glaciers, we have all kinds of things we need to deal with here. It was a little bit more difficult to, at least when I was looking at it in the beginning, when I was thinking about where I would put my focus on, for example, I started thinking about, could I do it just simply here in Iceland from an adaptation point of view? Can I see how the changes will influence males and females in different ways? And at the time, at least, I didn't have very much to work with. And partly it could be because it plays out differently, because we have stronger systems and we have different gender roles. Partly it is simply because the analysis hasn't been done. So there are a few cases that I do remember where someone actually sat down and did certain analysis, and they did find out that we also have these issues here, where we make certain decisions related to climate change policies. And then when we do the analysis afterwards, oh, okay, I guess everyone that received this funding was male. For example, in carbon sequestrations, there are these funds, and farmers could apply to get some money so they could grow up their land. And nobody, they were not thinking about gender when they were designing this particular intervention, and they found out it almost only went to males, and that had to do with how the ownerships of the farms is registered. You can only register one person, and that tended to be the man. So you could do it also, but it has been less focus on it, I would say.
Any more questions? Maybe I can then ask a question. So I've just worked from the economics department, so there's maybe a different focus there from here, but there is a lot of talk about like how economic cooperation and development aid might have a lot of problems with, also their aim is maybe to help, but that's not always the consequence. Do you think like having gender as a focus could help like shift at least, so it's more often good cooperation than bad? Or do you think that it doesn't really matter if it's...
I think it's not just about gender, it's also the having gender and intersectionality together, to be aware of that you cannot just bring in economic principles and not think about the people. And by being aware of who the people are through these kind of concepts, I think that can help us to just simply keep those that are supposed to benefit from the projects in mind, not just look at our graphs, but like, how is this impacting people that we want to help? I think that it can be a useful tool for that.
Any more? No questions?
Time for lunch.
Yeah, maybe. Oh, yeah.
If we still have time.
Yeah.
Now you're mentioning intersectionality. How are you working on with that? Because climate change is obviously affecting people differently where they are, and the richer people in the bigger cities are usually not targeted climate change in the same way. How do you do that in your research?
In terms of
working intersectionality, working with gender in just rural areas compared to the more to the urban ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just sort of, again, everything starts with this awareness. When I was doing my research, I was kind of focusing on gender more than anything else, and also, but through the research, and this was before Greta Thunberg and the Climate Fridays for Future, but through the research, actually the generation component came up quite strongly. I realized I did interviews, and I realized the younger the people were, the more personal of a problem it was for them. And I also saw that in certain issues, we had this issue of oil drilling that was being planned north of Iceland. And everyone in the political elites agreed, even in the left Greens. And it was the young people that changed the minds of the politicians. So that's a very important component, to have the generation, sort of the age, because if you are, you experience the problem quite differently if you know that you're actually going to have to deal with it yourself, here and now. It's not just something far away and in the future. And then, of course, there is research that I mean, just the fact that we're looking at development and whether you live in developing countries or rich country, the more labels you have on you as a vulnerable group, the more exposed you are to changes. But I think I have to say, though, that I have seen intersectionality because you asked about research, how it's being dealt with in research.
Yeah, and
I did not use it in my research, but I've seen articles about it. But the articles I've seen have been on a theoretical level. So it would be actually very interesting to see more sort of empirical kind of studies that work more systematically with that concept, for sure. Opportunities for those of you that are looking for research topics.
Okay. Yeah, so just thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. So I'm just going to use this opportunity and invite you to the next lecture. That's April 2nd. With Auður H, who's editor at the University of Iceland's Press, University of Iceland Press, who will talk about gender and the limits of Stoicism in the work of the Icelandic author Gyrðir Elíasson. The lecture will be in Icelandic, and you can find further information on the website.